Are you a physician who wants more autonomy in how you practice or fulfillment in your life? If so, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Change Physician podcast, where you can learn the mindsets, skills, and strategies to create the life you want without selling out your morals or values. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Cady, joined by my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and today I'll get the opportunity to speak with Dr. Cuccaro about his own journey and transformation. So why don't we just start off with the most basic question? And that would be, why'd you even go into medicine?
Why did I? All right, so I'm going to try to keep my answers short because I can definitely talk.
Hey,
But I went into medicine because I worked in a restaurant, and it sounds kind of crazy, but I got
that sounds
job.
crazy.
Yeah, I'm in college, right? And originally I went into college and I thought I was going to be a nuclear engineer and work on fusion reactors. And I should have recognized my mom because she's like, you don't want to do that. You are not an engineer. I'm like, oh, Mom, I know so much more. I'm 18, blah, blah, blah. Needless to say, my mother was correct. And within the first semester, I changed my major. And I didn't really know what I was doing. But then I started working in a restaurant probably, I think, the end of my freshman year, beginning of my sophomore year, or something like that. And what I found is I really enjoyed interacting with the guests. I enjoyed trying to improve their experience. I enjoyed, when they smiled and they were appreciative. And that was sort of my first kind of getting that if you're serving others and you're trying to make things better for them, that reflects back on you. What I didn't like about the restaurant, and we can talk about this in relation to medicine, was I recognized very early on it's a very hard life. The manager would be there till 2 a.m, and then we'd wake up. He'd be back at 5 when they're getting their produce and all this stuff. And I was like, man, these guys are working like dogs, and this is horrible. So I'm like, well, where else can you go and help people and maybe have a little bit better life? And so I picked medicine. For some people, maybe it seems shocking because you can work ungodly hours. But we'll talk about that in different things. There's a lot more to being a physician. I think nothing against restaurant owners, but I think you have a little bit more freedom as a physician. So I decided to apply to medical school, and I shouldn't say that. I decided to go into healthcare, and then it was 2 or 3 years later on that I actually decided to then go directly into healthcare. So I'd looked at PT, I'd looked at other health-related careers, and then it was toward the end of college I decided, you know what, I want to actually go into medicine. And my other intention with that is I came from a smaller town in Nevada, and I was thinking, well, what about being a rural doc? Like, a doc in the small town, that had such an appeal. You're the only doc and all this stuff. Built that up in my mind. And so that was my intention when I went into medical school. I wanted to help other people, and I thought, hey, I'm going to go live in a small town, and I'm going to be like the small town doc. So that's a long way to say that's why I went into medicine.
Gotcha. So, but when you, like, your mindset, like back then, when you were in pre-med, what did you think you'd accomplish, or what was your perspective then, if you can remember?
Of medicine in general?
Of just what you would get out of it, or what you'd hope to accomplish from medical field?
I think really it just came into, I wasn't one of these people that had this, I've never been able to map out my life like that. I have these general feelings, and that's what sort of guides me. And quite literally, my intention was this: I want to become a doctor so I can help other people, and I want to live in a small town and be their family doc. That was my intention. And I didn't think anything beyond that, really, which is kind of crazy and not, and realistically, folks, if you're making huge life-changing commitments like this, you probably should do a little bit.
Think about it.
You should have a little bit more of a thought process behind it, but that's what I did.
Well, so now that you were in the medical school, and then you get into resident, did anything shift or change in your expectations out of your training, or?
Well, a couple of things. So, the first 2 years of medical school were really interesting because you go in there wanting to help people. And I think they're changing this, but in the first 2 years of medical school, you're not really doing anything with anybody other than medical students. So you're just getting slammed with so much information. And I can't say I didn't not enjoy that. It was hard. I mean, we had test Mondays and Thursdays, I think. Basically, after the third week was every Monday, Thursday. And so you're studying all the time. But it wasn't horrible. I was always a pretty decent test taker, and I stumbled into pretty effective test taking strategies. and actually learning strategies now that I look back on it. So the first 2 years were busy, but they weren't bad. Clinical rotations for me were really, really hard. And so I think you're both overwhelmed by information. You kind of forget what your intention's going in. By this time, you're 2 years in, you have however many, tens of thousands of dollars in loans. Well, I was military, so I didn't have that much, but I had commitments. And the clinical rotations was so unstructured for me, and you were changing every month. And I didn't know where I fit. And I think that was a big thing for me, is I didn't know where I fit as a medical student. Nobody seemed to want to talk to you. Nobody really cared what you did other than you were supposed to do something. So it was quite challenging to me. And I think it was part of it was not kind of unstructured. So when I did graduate, and I did fine during residency, I could talk to people and actually enjoyed the people I worked with. I just found it very challenging. But when I did my internship, it was like a 180-degree shift. And so most people hated interns. I loved internship because now I had a purpose. I had a meaning. I knew what I did, what I was doing truly mattered, because other people were telling me it mattered, and I was responsible for things. Whereas when I was a medical student, I wasn't. So I loved internship. And everything just fell into place. I don't know exactly why. I maybe it was because the nurses were talking to me now and telling me, did you write these orders, versus ignoring me. So I loved internship. Then residency was also very, very challenging. Again, just because of the hours, what you're trying to learn, the stress, because I was in anesthesia, and life and death and all this crazy stuff, and people, surgeons changing every day, and some surgeons are more pleasant to work with than other ones. But I think the thing that truly changed my perspective, based on what I said so far, that small town family doc was my very, very first rotation out of, in third year, was internal medicine, which is the exact opposite of what I'd put on my schedule. Like, you put in how do you want your order to be? And that I wanted that to be last, and to be my first rotation. And it was hell. Like, not only was I trying to do, in this new environment, trying to find this new role where again, at least where I was at school, like as a medical student, it sucked. Like, I just didn't feel like I was doing something that meant anything. And I just didn't like it. Like, I didn't, and I sort of thought, well, maybe if this is, I think it was internal medicine, well, if this is the way it is, I'm not sure if I really like this. The next rotation, though, my next month, was surgery. And I had no interest in that. But my first, I don't even know how this happened. I was on anesthesia. It had broken into 2 weeks. So I did 2 weeks anesthesia and 2 weeks of surgery, or 2 weeks of some subspecialty thing. In anesthesia, all of a sudden I had a role, and the people I worked with were like, had expectations for me, and there were concrete things that I was supposed to be doing. And I loved the environment, because it was versus the floors where it was like freaking the Wild West, and it was, I don't know what they were doing. In the OR, a well-functioning OR was like this team, and it was like this ballet. In fact, I think one of my mentors called it a ballet, where there's this dance and dialogue with everyone, and I loved it. And so that was my second month, was this exposure to anesthesia. And after that point, I was like, this is everything I love. Like, it wasn't, the whole family, the small town family doc kind of went out the window, and it was anesthesia. I love being in this environment where you're working and there's this kind of structure to everything. And that sort of continued, I think, through my medical career. So that was my biggest perspective change. Was I went in with the intention of becoming a small town family practice doc, and not recognizing what that entailed, flipping around, becoming very interested in anesthesia and pursuing that very aggressively. And we may get into this, but now I actually work with a lot of family practice docs, and they're some of my favorite people. It was a big perspective shift when in medical school.
Yeah, it sounds like it was an aha moment it was experiential versus like, laid out plan. It wasn't some book you read. It was like you experienced the differences.
Oh, stark 180 difference. Yeah. So good. Heart go crazy. Ugh.
So let's move forward. You go into, anesthesia. Like, where does it go from there? Where's your, maybe in the private world, or maybe talk about your additional training?
Yeah. So I was doing anesthesia, or I should say in while I was doing my clinical rotations, obviously I had this interest in anesthesia. I met someone who said, hey, you should look at this pain thing. Did a couple, they weren't rotations. I actually just went on my own when I had time and went to a pain clinic and saw how people were delivering anesthesia in a pain clinic. And that looked all sexy, with the needles and injections, and wow, this is so cool. Total different.
Very defined and tell you where to go.
Very, and again, it seemed like you were doing something defined, and you were making such a big difference in people's lives. That was, I should say, the illusion that was sort of put forth.
Now, was this during your still in your residency, or were you out practicing?
That was my third year of medical school, third or fourth year of medical school.
Oh, okay.
I just went in, and then so I went into anesthesia with an interest in pain. My experiences during residency weren't that great when it came to pain, but there were elements that I always liked. So I liked psychology. I liked talking to people. I like some of the continuity, which sounds weird as an anesthesiologist.
Mm-hmm.
But
I get it.
yeah. So well, that's not to say, the other thing is people think anesthesia has no people skills. And I think anesthesiologists have to have some of the strongest people skills in the world, which I enjoyed. You meet somebody and trying to make them feel comfortable within 5 minutes. That's a skill set. And I enjoyed that. But I had an interest in pain. And so I decided to apply to a fellowship in pain medicine after that year, and talked to, because the Navy was paying for everything. So I had to get special approval and all this jazz. And then did my fellowship in pain, and I actually enjoyed that. Again, it was a great group of guys. We talked in the first episode about a level of awareness. I didn't have the awareness of sort of how the big system worked, or how I was too enmeshed in it to kind of see how that worked, but did start the process at Michigan to look at outcomes. So, do you know what you're trying to attempt to do, and what's the outcome that you're trying to get? And that was very firmly embedded into what I learned in that clinic. And that ended up transforming, totally changing how I practice medicine. So that was sort of that interest in pain at that particular time. And then after that fellowship is when I was pulled into Navy in San Diego, and I was doing anesthesia and pain. And that was again an interesting environment, because you're trying to straddle two horses with the anesthesia pain thing, which I found that's kind of difficult to do, particularly by this time I was really into pain and I didn't want to do anesthesia as much anymore. And then as you're out of the OR, you get very uncomfortable because of all that muscle memory starts declining. So it became more nervous and not as much fun. But that military environment was temporary. And what I mean by that is I knew I wasn't going to be a military physician. And so it almost became sort of like how you see medical school or even residency. It's just like, this is a 4-year stint that I'm going to get through. So you're kind of, people are much better at this than me, but I'm not looking long-term. All I'm thinking is, oh, this will be done in 4 years and then I'm going to go someplace else. So it was like a job, right? I was going in, I had a great mission, worked with some fantastic people, some absolutely amazing memories, like some of the best experiences of my life. But I didn't really think of the bigger picture of what a meaningful practice or what a meaningful life looks like, because I knew this was just one step to whatever came next.
So in the midst of that practice of those 4 years, was there a shift that happened by the end of that, or was there a shift that happened for you? Because you talked about, just this awareness and, when did that come?
So the pain shift started happening during my Navy time, when that clinical experience, right? And what happened there is, again, way back, I went into healthcare because I wanted to help people get better.
Right.
And now when you're not skipping, but shooting between every month, you're changing, like in medical school or even residency, you're kind of changing whatever. In that Navy environment, now I started seeing the continuity. And so rather than this little flashbulb moment, now I got to see the bigger picture. And what I saw was people not getting better, or if they did get better, I had no clue why, because it was completely inconsistent between individuals and between clinicians. and then being able to see what people say, oh, this works so well. And then you're like, well, I just saw that patient. And if that's what you call working well, I would hate to see what you said work badly because they're a mess. And so I didn't feel like I was helping people get better. At least I didn't feel like I was helping people to consistently get well and kind of figure out ways to extricate themselves out of healthcare. Meaning they may say they were, particularly in a pain clinic, they may say that they felt better, but they end up getting more injections, more medications, seeing more and more doctors. And I'm like, this is not how people get well. They should be seeing less of us and doing things in their life, not less. So I thought it was the model. So when I left the military, I went to Oregon, where I am now, joined a practice, but it was a solo pain specialist. And it was here that all of that summation of experiences kind of came together. And I recognized that the entire reason I had gone into medical school to begin with, to help people get better, was not what was happening. And that led me to first start questioning the interventions I've been trained in and going, whoa, actually, if you looked at the data without this bias of, hey, it's fun to do, it's feels cool to do, and you feel, it stokes your ego to be able to stick a 6-inch needle in somebody's body close to a major spinal nerve and do something.
It pays.
And it pays really well. But when you start looking at the objective data, it was so poor. And then I started looking at healthcare, and I was like, again, are we helping people to get better in healthcare? And for me personally, when I looked at the overall system, the system, people say this, we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. And again, I did not go into medicine to do sick care. I didn't want to manage misery. I wanted to help people get better. And so that started, that mind shift for me really hit a critical point in my first year out of Navy. So and also I guess I didn't have a time frame anymore, right? Now this was supposed to be the rest of my life. So it wasn't a stepping stone. This was it. This was my life. And that was the major kind of the wall, or the part where I was like, whoa.
Yeah. So it seems like it's a transition from just rotations or temporary assignments to livelihood.
Yeah, to livelihood with something that's open-ended.
Yeah.
There's no defined end anymore. And recognizing, to me, was like, there's no defined end to this. And is this where I want to be? Is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? Again, like managing misery, and not the reason that I went into healthcare, and practicing in a system that just looked at people like widgets. That was a very, very difficult time. And that's when I think I did, like, maybe some of the listeners, maybe I'd be questioning, was this a good decision? Was medical school, I'm now, again, I was in the military, so I didn't have as much debt, but when you're 40, 50, 60, I know people with $200,000, $300,000 in debt, and you start feeling trapped. And that is a horrible experience. Yeah. And again, just feeling so trapped and feeling so like, this is not what I want. Now, hindsight, obviously, as I can look back on that, it was a really good time for me, because it changed so much of there was so much growing that was involved with it. And now, again, I'm so glad I went to medical school. I am so glad I went into anesthesia. I am so glad that I have these experiences and knowledge. But back then, in that moment in time when I was like, this is not what I wanted to do, I was not happy. And I certainly didn't think I made a good decision.
Do you think, did it feel like a resentment towards the system?
Oh, hell yeah. No, absolutely. And I don't think that necessarily changed. I think the system's awful.
Yeah.
Intrinsically, there's a couple examples that I've heard people talk about, but overall, I don't think the system's very good.
Yeah.
And so what that changes, though, or at least for me, was recognizing that the system itself is there. What can I do? Because the things that I control are my actions, my thoughts, my responsibilities, my beliefs, behaviors, and perceptions. And those are the only things that I can actually change and work with. And so at some point, when I was, complaining, I wish they would do this, I wish they would do that, I wish they would do this, this needs today, this blah, blah, blah. And we do that. But at some point, I recognize that doesn't, I can't live like that. Like, what am I going to do? I have to do something for me. I have to actually take responsibility for me. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. And that, some difficult decisions in there, but ultimately was when I recognized that what I have control over, what I don't have control over, and then set up an idea of, well, okay, focusing on what I can control, what should I do next? And that change in perspective was crucial, I think, to the next phase of my journey.
Gotcha. What what would you say, speaking of taking responsibility and the choices you made through this journey, I mean, first of all, just simply what made you pick Oregon? Why'd you go there?
I knew I wanted to be on the West Coast.
Okay.
And because I grew up in northern Nevada, Carson Tahoe area, and I love the mountains and I love the West Coast. And I didn't want to go Midwest, flat and buggy and humid and all that jazz. I have no interest in the East Coast. I didn't want to go to the South, in Florida specifically, because it smells like it's rotting off the face of the earth. Sorry, people in Florida, but I'm a high desert guy. And so I was specifically looking for a smaller town on the West Coast that didn't have any full-time pain specialists. And that's a totally different conversation of why that was important to me. But in a university town, because my wife is a little bit more urban than I am. I'm definitely more rural, and we have some diversity in our family. And so I wanted to go to a place where we maintained some level of diversity, but wasn't a big town.
Yeah.
And so the place that we picked is a college town. So it's 50-something thousand people, but with the students, that adds another 20,000. And so the infrastructure is different. Like there's more here than a town of 60,000 people should have. So
that sounds well thought out. That's well thought out.
I did get better as I got older, making decisions, right? So I slowly learned through this stuff.
Yeah. Well, speaking of shifts that go on, like sometimes our biggest awakenings or insights can come from the most tumultuous moments in our lives. And I thought it might be interesting for people to just hear the gravity of just the emotions that people can go through when they're recognizing their life needs to change, or their career.
Yeah. And for physicians, again, I think this becomes very difficult because you have like two sets of handcuffs. You have the golden handcuffs, and then whatever color handcuffs debt would be. Like, I don't know what those are, lead or black, whatever. Yeah. Because you have this risk of high debt. And at the same time, when whatever the physician is, you're making generally more money than anybody else. We're one of the highest paid professions. Granted, there's questions of reimbursement and things, but when you're making 100,000+ at a minimum, you get trapped to the debt and you get trapped to the money. And then you start having to do these complex evaluations of what money means to you. So for me personally, I distinctly remember, like, this is not what I went into medicine to do. What am I supposed to do? I'm so, you feel pigeonholed because you're so specialized in training. You think the only thing you can do is be a doctor in a regular practice. I wasn't really aware of any other options at the time. And so the first thing I started looking at was, well, obviously you just save a bunch of money in the stock market and then you try to retire as quickly as possible. Right. So you're bankrolling all this money. And so that's eventually that was the first thing that I started focusing in, was how could we save money? Because then and it becomes the race of try to work yourself to death to make as much money so that you can find a way to get yourself out of working yourself to death. And at some point I was like, okay, I don't care if it's 5 years or 10 years, this is killing my soul. Mm-hmm. And when your soul's dying, how much money is that worth when you feel like your soul's dying?
Yeah.
And at some point I was like, money's not worthless, because what do I die? I actually had an experience during fellowship where we had one of our patients in the pain clinic was a pediatrician who had opened a practice with his wife, who was also a pediatrician, and they worked like dogs for years. And their kids were, I think, getting into college, and they were just a wonderful couple, but they worked so hard in this 2-person practice where they would alternate call as the husband and wife in this practice. And just when their life was supposed to change, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Mm. And I'm like, I just couldn't, like, you don't know what tomorrow is going to be. And you may say, I'm going to just put my head down and deal with this. And whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, and then I'm going to lift up my head again. And, you know, for some people that may work, but for me, all I could think of, well, you know, I'm killing my soul. And then what happens at the end of this if I get cancer in this, like this guy did? You know, is that a trade-off that I'm looking for? And really, when you don't have meaning in what you're doing, you know, it was just a horrible place to be. It was absolutely horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that it can create a very stressful and anxious time. I mean, I'm sure I'll be speaking of that.
Well, and
well.
here's the other thing, right? So I for a long time I didn't want to even share this, but my first year in clinical practice as a civilian, I was making $450,000 a year.
Yeah.
And then you're going, then, you know, and then I had the pain stuff, and I was like, I'm getting paid to do stuff that there's no clinical evidence for, that the more I'm learning, the more I'm pretty sure is actually causing harm to people, you know, not like they're dying right now, but I'm not improving long-term clinical outcomes for them. And I'm actually reinforcing these really bad pain beliefs that interfere with care. And so to change that, just the first step, you know, when you know, I was going through anxiety crisis and I was waking up, but to make the choice of, if you get paid to do something that you know in your heart is the wrong thing to do and you continue to do it, that really reflects at some point on your own morals and values. And I'm a pretty value driven person. So it wasn't an easy choice, but when I decided not to really just kind of scrap the interventions, my income dropped 87% in a month. And people are, oh, good for you. Well, let me just tell you, when you go to making 30-something thousand a month, and now you're making $5,000 a month, which still seems like a lot, and you know it's gonna, that was really, really hard to do. Yeah. Again, I think it was the right decision for me, and I think it was a very important turning point for me. But I understand really, really well what it means to be a physician and feel trapped by these golden handcuffs. And fear of what it means if all of a sudden the money stops. And folks, it sucks, but I would never ever want to go back to that place again. And there are different options, and it definitely can change how you see and how you live and create meaning, which we haven't gotten into yet, but yeah. It's definitely possible. So it was a very hard journey.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's helpful to kind of give a real sense of the shift, at least on a very superficial level. But diving deeper into the meaning and what your life looks now, how would you say things are in comparison?
Yeah. So I stumbled in it, like I stumbled in a lot of different things, is I knew what didn't work and what I didn't want to do. Yeah. And so then I spent a lot of time for a bunch of different practice related things, including a group that didn't want me anymore because I wasn't generating massive amounts of revenue, but then didn't want to separate under my contract because then the non-compete would go away. And for whatever reason, I was like, okay, wait a second. You're telling me that I'm not making enough money, but then you'd want to run out my contract because you think that I'm going to go up and open a clinic or something. I mean, it was just insulting to me. Like, oh, I'm telling you, these are my morals and values, and then you think I'm going to just walk out the door and like
violate them
all again. I'm like, you know, and there was a whole bunch. I had all these, you know, people lying in my face, and it was dirty. But anyway, because of this process, I had a lot of time to think as my contrast went out, and I did a lot of reading and started researching. And if you ever see my room, I have like stacks and stacks and stacks of research paper that I go through. So then I was like, well, I just want to talk about what the problems are, right? And I think a lot of physicians do that. Here's the problem with our sick care system. We have overutilization. We know that 80% of diseases are disease of or what we call chronic, or 80% of healthcare dollars go to the treatment of chronic disease, and diseases of chronic diseases are overwhelmingly diseases of lifestyle behavior. And the way you treat diseases of lifestyle behavior is not with pills and not with procedures and nothing else. It becomes lifestyle behavioral change. And then I started speaking on that, and just found into this weird thing that I love to teach, and I love speaking. And if you would talk to me 15 years ago, I was scared as public speaking, and I will go to any stage now. And And so through that, through just, I didn't know what was going to work or what was the right thing. I just knew what I needed to do, which was to start talking about this stuff. And as I started doing that, I also started looking at what alternatives are. And I started going, again, we talk about people saving all this money, and then the opposite extreme is you don't spend any money, and both of them don't work for most of us, because if you're living on canned goods and you have 2 kids, it doesn't seem to work really well you can make it work, but I'm not that limited.
Yeah.
Then I also started looking at business and I started looking at lifestyle and behavioral change, and that led me to sales and marketing. And I started really studying this world of how marketing, education, and sales interlaps with medicine. And people have this bad word about sales, but really sales is in its purest form is helping people to find the solution that works for them, and making clear that solution works for them in a way that is honest, right? So you're not the used car salesman trying to sell them junk. You're trying to say, hey, you said that you have this problem. Here's a solution that works for you. Here's why it works for you. Here's the reasons it works for you. Here are the steps that you can take, and here's what your expectations after using this thing. And so it overlapped and dovetailed really nicely with everything else I was learning, and became a really valuable skill set. And again, a different level now I was aware on a whole different level, something outside the world of medicine,
right,
that dovetailed really perfectly with medicine. So much so that now I would say that every physician should have some idea of what sales and marketing processes are. Like what is basic sales? What is basic marketing? How do you craft a message that resonates? How do you communicate effectively with another person? So anyway, that all started though with that sort of moment, kind of the worst moment in your life, when you're like, oh my God, why did I do medicine? And again, I would never ever want to not have done medicine. Such a powerful skill set. And then you marry it to something else for me. And yeah, great. It was a good transition.
Yeah. So you're an online and offline teacher of pain, stress, and several other wellness topics.
Yeah, so
right?
I've gotten grants. I've had some really large-scale grants to go in and try to change clinical practices, and I love working with clinicians and physicians specifically. I kind of resonate better with them. So I've done lots and lots of pain and clinical education and training. I moved into creating courses and programs, because if we're knowing again that the vast majority of chronic diseases are lifestyle and behavior, you have to craft a solution that works for people. Different mindset, different skill set. Really enjoyed that. Enjoy the people I work with. Never had the ease associated with massive money coming in for doing things that harm people. But so much more meaningful work, and also a skill set that I feel much more confident. Like if someone came in and just wiped you out, that would be horrible. But because of the learning I've done, not only for medicine, but outside of medicine, I feel more confident in what I would do in that scenario. So I am more certain when faced with uncertainty than I ever was before. And again, that's a little mind shift that's different and super, super valuable. Is being comfortable when times are uncertain. And this has certainly worked well based on when we're recording this podcast, which is the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and all sorts of crazy stuff is happening.
Yeah.
And, I'm like, crazy stuff happens, but I know a lot of fundamental strategies and skills. And so I'm not nearly as worried as I would have been, say, 10 years ago.
Right. Well, speaking of this sense of being more comfortable with the uncomfortable or uncertainty that can be there, what would you say to yourself now that you know what you know now? what would you tell yourself, I guess, when you're embarking on medical school, like what your expectations or the direction you should be going?
I think I would have, and I would have recommended myself to, one, be more open to questioning things. Rather than be, I'm going to do this, I know this is the right thing, blah, 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 blah. Just be more open to the experience and journey itself. So, and use everything as a learning opportunity. This is a challenge. What can I learn from this? And that would be probably the question that I would reflect on every day, is what could I learn from this? So even those difficult rotations that I tucked on, and feeling as a medical student in clinical rotations that things didn't make sense at all. And, what was the point if nobody looks at the medical student's note? Like, why am I spending 3 hours to write a note? Well, first question is, why am I spending 3 hours to write a note? The second one is, why was I upset when nobody read my note? And it's like, what can you learn? What you can learn? The other part, though, is I think I would really recommend, in hindsight, is have a greater appreciation. Sales has such a bad name and this bad connotation to it, but a basic understanding of sales and marketing principles would have served me so well, even during just being able to navigate clinical rotations, residency, and all this other stuff, because it's all about communicating.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that you can do to improve your communication skills, a lot of which is from listening. That people think, communicating is just telling people to, no. It's all about listening, hearing what they say, understanding what they say, and then reflecting back what your intent is in a way that they understand, and then making sure that they understand it. I think that was the other thing that I would do. So really is, what can I learn from this? That's more of a challenge-based mindset. And the second part is really appreciating and starting to learn at that time principles of salesmanship and marksmanship, which is really about kind of behavioral lifestyle change and persuasive communication.
Nice. Well, speaking of persuasive communication, is there a book or resource that made a big difference?
There's many, but I think the biggest resource, like, again, through hindsight bias, one of the books that had the greatest impact on my career as a physician, and as a physician who's sort of gone down different pathways, so as a changed physician, would be Switch by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, who are brothers. And Switch is about behavioral change, and they wrote it predominantly for institutions and organizations. But when I just remember reading it, because they were talking about how behaviors change, and again, how organizational behaviors change. And I remember reading that book and going, holy crap, this is why the healthcare system is so backwards, because we think that if I just give you a handout or more information, change behavior, and that doesn't. And they did a great job of taking a lot of kind of behavioral change strategies and making it really simple in that book. And that was probably it was eye-opening experience for me. It's one of my top recommendations of books, particularly when you're looking at trying to get healthcare and health transformation. So that would be the book that I would recommend, would be Switch by Chip Heath and Dan Heath.
Nice. Well, that makes me realize I need to buy another book. I haven't read that one, but that one's awesome. Well, I think there's a lot that comes from your journey, and there's definitely many times I think the shifts require a lot of courage and humility, and even if we don't necessarily want to relive those days, they're the times that you had to go through, and that's the only way you get on the side of it. And I think that it's a powerful statement that there is a lot of light that comes through that darkness. And I can say, I'm sure, through my story too, and others that we'll interview in the future, that there is a shift, and we got to be okay with just going through that and experiencing those feelings, as much as they're not comfortable, but recognizing that it's just a process that our whole being has to go through in order to realize that shift or that change that we want, even if it's not always clear at the front end. Sometimes it's, like you said, you knew what you didn't want. And I think that is something that we have to acknowledge and admit to before we can even really consider a brighter future in a different way than maybe we've originally designed it. And it's okay, that's okay. Any thoughts on my reflection of your journey? Or
I think that makes I totally agree with you. And those moments of trauma can either be, you can use them be trauma in damaging and get upset and and feel like there's nothing that you can do and wail at the injustice, or you can use them for change. And again, just going back through some of the most difficult time periods of my life, many of which occurred both through medicine and in the practice, but a couple that happened before, earlier in my life, those are also the opportunities for the greatest amount of growth and learning.
Right.
And if I could remember the passage from Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet, which is another really great book, he talks about, how pain and suffering has really been one to, it allows you the opportunity to learn. It, breaks the pot open so that you have the opportunity again. And I'm totally butchering like 3 different passages in there and combining them into one, but really is just the recognition is everything that occurs to you, you can learn from it. And some of the most important learning occurs during those periods, those darkest periods. So.
Right. That's great. Well, I appreciate you sharing your story and being transparent to let other people learn from you. And on this episode, it's just the beginning of many stories and transformations. And in the Change Physician podcast, I hope that you find some just some inspiration and light, that there can be something for you. And hopefully all these different stories will, certain ones might resonate more than others, and that you can redesign your career in a way that suits you. And so we look forward to seeing you on the next podcast. If you ever have any questions or comments, or somebody that you want to have featured on our podcast, feel free to reach out to us with our contact information below, and we'll get back to you, and or you just show up with that podcast one day. So, all right. Well, I'm Melissa Cady with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Hey folks, stay well.